So if you think about space, right, so there's Elon Musk involved in the space industry. You have Jeff Bezos now involved in the space industry. Richard Branson now involved in the space industry. So out with NASA and the major governments and the government organizations on behalf of the different governments across the world involved in the space industry. Now suddenly you've got billionaires involved in the space industry as well. So what are they starting to do? Well, not all of them who are involved in the space industry are wanting to fly out into space. They're wanting to start to develop it. So Elon Musk's wanting for us to move to Mars. Now, why is he wanting to move to Mars? Because ultimately he sees, essentially, if you look back in terms of the expansion of the sun, if you went back billions of years, Earth would have been like Mars essentially 2-3 billion years ago. So as the sun starts to expands, suddenly more heat comes across. So the way it works is, for people to understand, is, the Earth basically, it's not actually a perfect sphere. So what it is it's actually operating at a small angle. Now the Earth spins around like that, right? And then it spins around the sun. And depending on the angle of the Earth at the time, this is how we move in and out of ice ages. So, if you think about it, is we're actually coming out of an ice age right now. So the planet is heating up. Now, people might say, oh, well, we're speeding up the heating of the planet with CO2 emissions. I definitely believe what we're creating on Earth, essentially by chopping down huge amounts of the rainforests, we are, changing the climate that's happening here. But let's not realize is that if we start to get to net zero, the climate won't change anyway. Of course it's going to change. It's been changing over history and time. We will ultimately move back into an ice age, I think within 20,000 years. And then, it'll drift, and that'll be where the Earth moves in and out. But ultimately, we're 7.5 billion people on Earth. We're chopping down all the rainforests. We're like gannets going through everything, or the locusts. So we're basically going through all the vegetation. We're eating into wildlife where animals lived. Suddenly, there's variations in climate change, whether we're speeding this up in terms of what we're doing with fossil fuels and coal production and oil production. Ultimately, we're changing the planet itself, but the planet is also changing. So if you think about it, why wouldn't we want to move to Mars? So if you actually watch Elon Musk speak about this, ultimately Mars is a place that he believes the future of the human race will have to survive. Now, if there's not any sort of nuclear war, which is going to happen out in Russia, if there's not any changes to the planetary systems, I don't think it's going to change. It's not as bad as everyone says. I don't believe that. But, in millions of years, if we're a species on this planet, ultimately the Earth is going to change and become more like Venus, because the sun is going to expand, it's going to get hotter, and it's going to be the way we live right now. Essentially, it's not going to be livable in the way it is this specific moment in time. So suddenly, let's move to Mars. Now, at first, that sounded like sort of Star Trek stuff back from the 60s and 70s. But really, if you think about it, is we're starting to put probes out there. We're starting to create this opportunity to live out there. And, ultimately, Elon Musk is wanting to create in his lifetime the first colony of human race out in Mars. So he wants us to move out to essentially Mars as a new colony. So people suddenly think, well, does that affect me in a day-to-day life? Not really, but you've now got a billionaire starting to push the boundaries, and you've got private companies starting to push the boundaries. So if you think of Copernic Space, what they're actually trying to do is they're trying to democratize ownership to allow people out there starting to get access into this system. So they think, well, what have they been able to do? Well, ultimately, we're starting to send, like any rocket that we send to different planets, like to the moon, stuff like that. We actually put stuff in these rockets and we send it out to the moon and we leave it there for future generations. So in thousands of years, they'll be on the moon and then they'll suddenly find this box and we've locked all this stuff in a box and they'll be able to think, why did the people of Earth 1,000 years ago send all this stuff to the moon? But now Copernic Space has actually got space on rockets going to the moon, so they're now able to send stuff out there. Now, up until now, when we were sending things, it was actually physical objects you could only send. What they're able to do is, because of digitization, they're actually digitizing. So people are getting NFTs. They're creating NFTs, essentially putting on some form of flash drive or some way of actually holding this NFT, and they're actually sending it out to the moon itself. So suddenly, some of these NFTs you're getting created with these that you see on there, essentially Web3 market space, will be on the moon forevermore. Now, because they've got a small space in this rocket, and if they had put some physical object in there, it limits what they're able to send. But now what they're able to send is this ability to send masses of stuff out there. And then if you want to create an NFT, and if you get it minted through Copernic Space and it sells well, that NFT will be available on the moon essentially forevermore. So if for some reason our society ends up going through some sort of disaster, we wipe out, what actually happens? Well, ultimately, what you'll find is that in years to come, all these NFTs that they've created will be on the moon. So people will be able to access it. Well, that sounds okay. But really, if you start to think about it, is you can create something now whereby if the internet broke and then suddenly we had some mass electrical surge and we all went offline, then and they've sent this stuff out to the moon, then ultimately it's going to last forevermore. It's a bit like the old putting a note in a bottle out to sea if you're on a desert island and it floats around and then somebody gets the bottle with the note inside. Really, that's taken it forward. So that's one aspect of this Web3 economy that they've created. The other thing is satellite technology. Now, you might think, well, what does satellite technology is? And this is where a key part of the space race is. So why do governments want to get involved in this? Well, ultimately, when we were actually transferring information across and data across, it was never through satellites. So if you thought about Putin, let's speak about what's happening in Ukraine with Russia. The first thing he did in the beginning of the war when Russia invaded Ukraine was to knock out their communication systems. Ultimately, they were getting a lot of their power from Russia. They were knocking everything out. And they've created this essentially, we've knocked out their communication systems. They can no longer access the internet. We can control the media and we can control the information flow which is happening out there. So if you think back to the Gulf War, which we spoke about before, ultimately when the US and the UK invaded Iraq, the information that we were able to get through the media was essentially controlled by the media. It was the information that the government wanted you to see that's coming out there, because people on the ground didn't have that information. But now, because we've all got iPhones and we've all got some sort of smartphone and we've got access to the internet, well, we can actually film this thing. So we can choose that. So when they had these types of rockets in the past, oh, it's the Patriot missile. Whatever missile they fire, boom, we just take it out. Success rate's 99.3%. The bombs that we are sending into Iraq, boom, they're not killing any they're not killing any good guys. They're so, we can actually get this thing so accurate. It can come through a window and boom, knock out the bad guy that's fighting on behalf of Saddam Hussein or the Taliban or things like that. And ultimately, there's no civilians killed. And then because the media is controlling this information, and it's propaganda either way. And if you look at any war going back, propaganda is key, depending on what side you are. Propaganda is still there just now. But because suddenly we've all got these devices, we can now basically film it. Well, wait a minute. Putin says he's not hitting any civilian targets. Shh, there's a block of flats. There's a hospital. There's a school. He's just basically firing bombs into these things. We can film it. We can upload it. We can look it online, and we can see whatever anyone else is sort of disputing this information. That information shows that he's firing rockets into civilian targets, and we can control this. But if he knocks out the communication systems in the country, so he can actually just blow up all the sort of, pylons where they've actually got the towers, where they're carrying information, then we can't do this. But because Elon Musk had satellites in space, he can ultimately just go, well, wait a minute, I'm just going to put a satellite over Ukraine, and then suddenly everyone in Ukraine has now got access to the internet through Elon Musk's satellite, and then information on the ground from the people within the country now can be dispersed through this access to technology. And that's the power of satellites, and that's why people need to understand that. And ultimately, when you were looking at the space race, and Trump was Space Force, he wanted a Space Force. We're going to conquer space. We'll have a Space Force. It becomes sort of James Bond type characters. But I think it was the one with, not View to a Kill. I'll think of it in a minute. It was with Roger Moore. But ultimately, you're going back to that type of technology where they're controlling that information. Now, billionaires and people out there are putting up their own satellites. But really, what's Copernic Space able to do? Well, one of their key aspects of what they're actually running is they're now using satellite technology to essentially track poachers in Africa who are killing rhinos. So what they're doing is they're killing rhinos, chopping off the horns. They're sending it out to Asia. People are using this as for different types of herbal medication, things like that as well. So ultimately, these poachers are killing rhinos, and it's very difficult because the amount of land or the size of the land on these reserves are so big that you just can't monitor it person to person. But with satellite technology, suddenly be able to track the rhinos, once track the poachers, track the information is completely changed. So Copernic Space is starting to use satellite technology, and if you invest in anything that's involved in Copernic Space, they're now providing this ability for you to have a small ownership through their Copernicus Space coins, through their platform. And this is actually helping track rhinos and stop poachers shooting rhinos as well. So you think, well, wait a minute, this technology now can be used for good as well as bad. So ultimately, this is and we're just starting to scratch the surface of what we can actually do in space. If you think of what the internet's done in the last 20 years. So the internet of the last 20 years is back in the early 90s, everything we did was by phone and fax. Young people won't even know what a fax machine is, but this is how you sent documentation. Suddenly, internet came along. We had access to email, and that was a huge thing at the time. Suddenly, I can send you an email, which was essentially an electronic letter. I can click a button. It can go down and it was used by the old copper phone lines before it became all fiber, and it would run down there. You switch your phone off. You'd use this to change the communication. It would pixelize the letter. It would ultimately take it along this communication line. It wasn't instantaneous, but it was very quick. And then suddenly it would come up somewhere else in the world, and you would be able to send this email. 25 years later, the internet has evolved in so many ways that this technology has changed absolutely everything. So the blockchain comes along. So what's the blockchain going to do? Well, blockchain essentially is like the next iteration of the internet. Ultimately, people talk about it as Web 3.0. They talk about it as finance of the internet, this ability to essentially transfer money in a way that they've never been able to do, an ability to share information in a way they've never been able to do. So ultimately, if you think about Bitcoin, I always say it in a sort of simplistic way, is what Bitcoin did is it's a technology. Now, most people think of Bitcoin as a commodity. You're buying Bitcoin to ultimately put amount of value into this sort of certain cryptocurrency. So say Bitcoin's worth $20,000, you want to buy half a Bitcoin for $10,000. Ultimately, you're holding on to this $10,000, and because there's a finite amount of Bitcoin, that ultimately you're hoping over the next 5 years, if you hodl, which is to hold on to the cryptocurrency for that 5 years and not sell it, it will go up in value in the same way you invest in gold and silver and any type of stock. But what Bitcoin actually did, which was amazing as a technology, was it was allowing you to transfer money instantaneously anywhere in the world, cutting out essentially banking fees, cutting out international transaction fees, cutting out finance charges. Ultimately, it was the cost was you buying a good from here to say to Asia instantaneously, and you can send that money and the user gets that money and it happens like that, where before when you sent money, it went through multiple banks. So if you think about that, what's that about to do? It's a bit like email at the start of the internet. It's actually changed everything in how we transport information. For finance, everything's going to be changed because of what I've actually explained what Bitcoin did. So ultimately, banks are about to have to change the way they make their economic model, because they're holding on to this idea that they charge you fees to use your money. But as the banking systems change, ultimately, some banks will change. They will take over. They will run their own blockchains, but they will not be able to charge the fees to hold your money. And the way you're going to access money is going to change again. And then because this technology is coming along, and now we can have fractional ownership of things through things like tokenization, which I'm involved with in terms of tokenizing energy assets. Ultimately, what it does is it allows not the richest people in society access to finance, but also the poorest people in society accessing finance in a different way than they've ever had before. And ultimately, a lot of that is asset ownership. So if you think of what Copernic Space is doing, they're going into this space economy. And I've just talked about satellites. You start to think of what satellite technology can start to do. It can change everything. You're no longer affected by the weather in terms of information and what you're holding information. But then suddenly these satellites become powerful. Because the best thing, if you were Putin right now, is you want to basically send up a spaceship and knock out Elon Musk's satellites, because ultimately the next thing you know is it blocks out all communication that's coming to Ukraine right now. So therefore, when they talk about Trump with his Space Force and other countries wanting to create variations of Space Force, the first thing they want to do is to essentially control the satellite technology in the same way we protect shipping routes right now. Goods are getting transported across the world. If we didn't protect these big, huge tankers that are basically transferring goods across the world in some form or other, and creating safety to ship things back and forward, ultimately pirates would come on and steal all the loot. It still happens in certain parts of the world, but ultimately the days of the pirates have changed. All we're doing is moving this forward into space. So what Copernic Space are trying to do is they're saying, as a group, we can actually have power in this new space economy that's happening out there through democratization of ownership and fractionalized ownership of the assets that were going out there. And it's just starting out there. So that's what's so interesting in what these guys are actually looking to do. Ultimately, I was wanting Grant to come on and explain more about his space economy. Let me check the email one last time. He dropped me a mail. I know he's a busy guy. So it's, and I didn't want to do it, but let's have a look. I'll wait and see if the email's coming in. But no, I didn't get another email from him. So we're going to have to bring him back in at another time to speak about Copernic Space. But if you think of the space economy, this new Web3 market space, this access to satellite technology, this ability to create life on other planets, if you think of the, man, woman, how long we've been here, and if you think of, the universe is about 13 billion years old, this planet's 5 billion years old, essentially prehistoric man, we're going back 5 million years. We've been on here. We've only really been keeping records, for essentially 3,000 years. It was really philosophies just started back, with Plato and Socrates and people like that, 300 years BC. So it was only then, out of 13 billion years, it's only 300 years BC, which is 2,500 years, that we've really started to keep information. So Aristotle wrote these 200 documents and only 30 odd survived. And Aristotle and a lot of his thinking in terms was adopted by the Catholic Church. That created the way our society started to form. So, and that's only going back, and the Catholic Church started to implement that essentially 1,000 years ago. So you're only looking back 1,000 years, and it's only in the last 100 and only the last 50 years that we've really started to share information and being connected as a species as we are right now. So what's interesting about the space economy is that this is basically the future of how the world's going to be going forward. And there's so many good things from this space economy, and a company like Copernic Space, well, they are one of the leaders in the field. So apologies for all the space geeks out there who are wanting to meet Grant, and they've just had my basic background on the Copernic Space. But the good thing is, we've started out, we've done a little bit of information on that. Liz Truss has finally got the boot in the UK, going down in history as the worst prime minister in UK history. And that's a pretty difficult thing to do. There's been some beauties in charge, but essentially, let's bring her back in for one last one from NBC. Here we go. Liz Truss